Stay with me. You don't get to die for me.
Min is worth it.
I am still your blood. You stopped being my family the moment you pulled that trigger.
The rain came down in sheets over Koreatown that night, each drop catching the electric bleed of neon signs, pink, red, and cobalt blue smeared across wet asphalt like an open wound. Sirens wailed somewhere behind the smoke, and orange light bled up from a burning storefront 2 blocks down, painting the low clouds the color of a dying fire. Deborah felt her boots hit the pavement half a second before she heard the shot. Instinct is faster than sound. She was already moving, already turning her shoulder into Min-jun's chest, already driving the man she'd sworn her life to protect down and back and out of the sniper's line, when the round found her instead. It hit high on her left side, punching through the ceramic plate of her vest with a force that folded her at the waist, stole the air from her lungs, and dropped her hard against Min-jun's arm. For a moment neither of them moved. The rain kept falling. Somewhere a car alarm shrieked into the night. Min-jun caught her. Of course he caught her, he always would, hauling her weight up under one arm, his tailored black suit soaking through, dark hair plastered to his forehead, his face twisting from shock into something colder and far more dangerous. Behind them, his enforcers spilled out of the armored SUVs, guns already drawn, forming a wall of black coats and grim faces against the burning skyline. A police cruiser idled uselessly at the mouth of the alley, its lights spinning red and blue over the whole scene like it belonged to some other, smaller world. "Stay with me," Min-jun said, low and furious, gripping the front of her vest where blood was already spreading dark and warm beneath his palm. "You don't get to die for me. Not like this." Deborah's jaw was clenched tight against the pane, her breath coming in short, ragged pulls, one leg buckling beneath her while the other fought to keep her upright, keep her standing at her king's side 1 second longer. She'd taken worse. She told herself that. She wasn't sure it was true. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Min-jun was the one they wanted, the boss, the heir, the man who'd inherited an empire built on blood and now stood to lose it in one wet, screaming night. He'd spent his whole life learning to calculate risk, to treat loyalty as a ledger entry, something bought and sold and never truly given. And now the one woman who'd given him everything, without asking for a single thing in return, was bleeding out in his arms on a street that was about to become a battlefield. Min-jun looked down at his ruined suit, at the blood soaking into the fabric, and something in him went very still and very cold. Whoever had ordered this had just made the worst mistake of their life. He would burn this city to its foundations to find out who. The audience is immediately dropped into a world where Korean neon signs reflect off rain-slicked pavement. Min-jun, pristine in his tailored black suit, holds up a severely wounded Deborah, whose tactical vest is pierced and bleeding. Behind them, stern, armed enforcers step out into the rain. The audience is confronted with an engaging question, when a man who built his life on calculating risk trades his empire to avenge the woman who protected him, is it justice, or total self-destruction? 3 hours before the world came apart, the peace summit had gone almost too well. Min-jun sat across a lacquered black table from the leaders of the Choi faction, his hands folded, his face arranged into the practiced calm his father had spent years drilling into him. He was 29 years old and had worn the crown of Koreatown's most powerful syndicate for less than a year, and every meeting like this one was a test he refused to fail. Behind him, standing at parade rest with her hands clasped in front of her, Deborah watched the room the way she watched every room, not the faces, but the exits, the hands, the angles a threat might come from. She'd been at Min-jun's side for 6 years now, ever since a job overseas that neither of them talked about anymore. And in that time she'd learned to read the temperature of a room before Min-jun had finished his opening pleasantries. Deborah didn't trust the Choi men. She never had. Their smiles were too even, their handshakes too firm, the kind of firmness men used when they wanted you to remember the strength of their grip instead of the words coming out of their mouths. But peace was peace, and peace meant Min-jun's fragile new reign got another few months to solidify before the wolves at the edges of his territory decided he was young enough to test. To prosperity, the eldest Choi said, raising a glass of soju. To prosperity, Min-jun echoed, and did not mean it, and knew the other man didn't either, and that was fine. That was business. They left the restaurant a little after midnight, out onto the wet neon sprawl of the avenue, rain needling down through the glow of storefront signs and streetlights smeared into long colored ribbons on the asphalt. Min-jun's convoy waited at the curb. 2 armored SUVs, engines idling, his personal guards fanned out in a loose perimeter with their coats buttoned high against the weather. It was routine. It was the kind of walk Deborah had made with him 100 times, 30 feet of open pavement between a doorway and a car door, the most dangerous 30 feet in any protection detail and the one everyone stopped worrying about because nothing had ever happened there before. Deborah felt it before she understood it. A wrongness in the air, some old instinct honed by years of exactly this kind of walk, and her eyes cut up and across the street to the black windows of a shuttered high-rise where no light should have moved and something moved anyway. Down, she said, and didn't wait to see if Min-jun listened. The first explosion tore through a storefront half a block away, a gas main or a planted charge, it didn't matter which, the night turned white and orange all at once, and glass rained down through the rain, and screaming replaced the ordinary noise of the street with something older and more primal. Min-jun's guards scattered into defensive positions, weapons out, shouting orders that got swallowed by the chaos. A second explosion ripped through a parked car across the avenue, flipping it onto its side in a gout of flame, and the whole street became a corridor of fire and smoke and shattered light. Deborah had Min-jun's shoulder in her fist, already hauling him sideways, already reading the trajectory of the danger before the second shot ever came. She'd clocked the sniper's angle from the high-rise the second she'd seen it, some cold mathematical part of her brain drawing a line from that dark window straight through the space where Min-jun's head would be if he took one more step toward the car. She shoved. Min-jun staggered, cursing, catching himself against the SUV's door frame, and Deborah stepped into the space her employer had just vacated. The round took her high in the chest, a sound like a fist against a drum, and the impact folded her at the waist and drove the air from her lungs in one violent exhale. The vest held. Barely. She felt the plate crack under the force of it, felt something give deep in her ribs, and the world tilted sideways as her legs forgot how to hold her weight. Deborah. Min-jun's voice cracked on the name, all his careful composure gone in an instant, and he was there, catching her before she hit the ground, both of them soaked through in seconds, rain running down her face like something trying to wash away what had just happened. Around them the guards had gone fully feral, weapons up, forming a wall of black coats and grim faces between their boss and the burning street, firing blind suppression rounds toward the high-rise while more explosions rippled down the avenue like a string of firecrackers set by a patient, deliberate hand. "Hold the perimeter," Min-jun shouted, and his voice had changed, dropped into something Deborah had heard only once or twice before, a register with no mercy left in it. "Nobody moves until I say. Cho, the SUV, now." He didn't wait for help. He got his arms under her and hauled her up himself, blood already soaking warm and raw through his own suit jacket, and half-carried, half-dragged her the last few feet to the armored SUV while his guards laid down cover fire behind them. Deborah's vision swam. She tried to say something, an apology, maybe, or an order, some last piece of professional advice about angles and exits. But her lungs weren't cooperating, and all that came out was a wet, ragged breath. "Don't talk," Min-jun said, climbing in after her, slamming the door as the driver gunned the engine and the SUV lurched away from the curb, tires screaming against wet asphalt. "Don't you dare talk. Don't you dare do anything except breathe." Behind them, the avenue burned. Sirens converged from 3 directions. And somewhere in that dark high-rise window, whoever had pulled the trigger was already gone, leaving nothing behind but a bleeding woman and a boss whose calm, careful world had just come apart at the seams. The clinic on 4th Street didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. Everyone who needed to find it already knew where it was, and everyone who found it by accident learned quickly to forget the address. Min-jun kicked the door open with his shoulder, Deborah's weight sagging against him, blood soaking through both their clothes now, and the receptionist, a thin, nervous woman who'd seen this exact scene more times than she cared to count, took one look at his face and didn't bother asking questions. Dr. Park. Now, Min-jun said, and when the woman hesitated half a second too long, he set his jaw and repeated it in a voice that made the decision for her. Dr. Park came out from the back and scrub still creased from sleep, took one look at the wound, and started barking orders before he'd even finished crossing the room. Deborah was laid out on a gurney under fluorescent light that made everything look too pale, too fragile, and the doctor's hands moved fast and sure over the ruined vest, cutting away fabric, assessing damage with the flat, practiced calm of a man who'd patched up worse and worse conditions. Punctured lung, Dr. Park said. Maybe more. I need her in surgery in the next 4 minutes or I lose her. Then you have 3 minutes and 50 seconds, Min-jun said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a pistol on his hip that everyone in the room could see, and a look on his face that made the threat of it almost unnecessary. You keep her alive, Dr. Park. Whatever it costs. Whatever you need. She does not die on your table. The doctor didn't argue. He'd worked for the syndicate long enough to know when an order wasn't really an order at all, but a prayer dressed up as one. He wheeled Deborah back through a set of double doors, nurses falling in around the gurney, and the door swung shut behind them with a soft, final sound that left Min-jun standing alone in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old fear. He looked down at his hands. At the blood soaked black into the cuffs of his shirt, dried now at the edges, still tacky at the center where it had pooled thickest. He looked at his ruined jacket, at the handprint of red pressed into the fabric where he'd held her against his chest in the back of the SUV, and for the first time since the first explosion had lit up the avenue, he let himself think clearly about what had actually happened. It hadn't been random. A stray round from a panicked rival, a warning shot gone wrong, that was the story that would spread by morning, and it was a lie. The angle had been too clean. The timing too precise, coordinated exactly with the explosions meant to create chaos and confusion, meant to draw every eye except the one eye that mattered, the one trained on that 30 feet of open pavement between the restaurant door and the car. Someone had planned this. Someone had known his route, his timing, the exact moment his guard would be lowest. Someone had wanted him dead, and had very nearly gotten his best fighter killed instead. Min-jun's hands curled into fists at his sides, and something in his chest went cold and quiet and absolutely certain. He pulled out his phone. Everyone, he said, when the call connected to his lead lieutenant. Every lieutenant, every captain, every soldier we have. I want them awake and I want them armed within the hour. Koreatown is locked down, nobody in, nobody out, until I say otherwise. And I want every safe house, every hangout, every rat hole those Choi bastards or anyone else might be hiding in searched from the floor to the rafters. Boss, if we move like this, the police. I don't care about the police, Min-jun said, and his voice had gone very soft, which was somehow worse than shouting. I don't care about the choice. I don't care about the board, the elders, or anyone else who thinks they have an opinion about how I run my city tonight. Someone put a bullet in my head of security. I intend to find out who, and I intend for them to regret it with the very last thing they do on this earth. Are we clear? There was a pause on the other end. Then, clear, boss. Min-jun ended the call and stood alone in the hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of surgery through the doors, and did not move from that spot for a long time. By the time the sun rose gray and reluctant over Koreatown, the city had already begun to burn in earnest. Min-jun's forces hit 3 locations before dawn. A gambling den run out of the back of a noodle shop, a chop shop garage that fenced stolen weapons for half a dozen smaller crews, and a supply warehouse that funneled product through 3 rival operations at once. Doors came off hinges. Men who thought they had nothing to fear from a grieving, distracted boss learned in the space of a few brutal minutes exactly how wrong they'd been. Min-jun didn't lead the raids himself. He couldn't, not with Deborah still fighting for her life on an operating table, but he watched the reports come in on his phone with the same flat, merciless attention he might once have given a quarterly ledger, and every name that came back clean only sharpened the question burning in the back of his mind. Who? Who had done this? Who had known enough, planned enough, to turn the safest 30 feet of his life into a kill box? By mid-morning the fires were visible from 3 districts over, columns of black smoke rising into a gray sky already heavy with the promise of more rain. Police cordons went up on half a dozen streets. News vans arrived to film the wreckage of the gambling den, reporters speaking in hushed, urgent voices about a sudden and inexplicable outbreak of gang violence in Koreatown, the worst the city had seen in years. Rival bosses who had spent the last decade maintaining careful, unspoken truces began making calls of their own, trying to determine whether this was the opening move of an all-out war or something stranger, something aimed at Min-jun alone. It was in the wreckage of the third raid, the supply warehouse, that they found something useful. An arms dealer named Sue, dragged out from behind a stack of crates with his hands raised and his composure long gone, talking fast in the hope that fast talking might buy him a few more years of life. The round, he said, when Min-jun's second-in-command described the wound to him in cold, clinical detail. Custom armor piercing, has to be. Nobody sells that off the street. I know maybe 3 people in this whole city who could source that kind of ammunition, and only one of them has the clearance to move it without half our own network hearing about the sale. Give me a name, Min-jun's lieutenant said. Sue gave him one. It wasn't a rival gang's quartermaster. It wasn't a Choi enforcer or an outside mercenary broker. It was a supplier who worked exclusively, quietly, and at significant markup for a single client. Someone deep inside Min-jun's own organization, someone with the standing and the money to order custom ordnance without anyone asking why. When the report reached Min-jun, he read it twice, sitting in a hard plastic chair outside the surgical ward, still in his ruined suit because he hadn't let himself leave long enough to change. Whoever had done this hadn't reached in from outside. They'd reached out from within. The board convened the following evening in a windowless room on the 17th floor of the syndicate's tower, the kind of room built specifically for conversations no one wanted recorded. 6 elders sat around a long table, men who'd built the empire alongside Min-jun's father and now watched his son run it with the wary, proprietary concern of people who believed they still had a say. At the head of the table sat Elder Kong. Min-jun's uncle, his father's oldest friend, the man who'd taught Min-jun to shoot and to negotiate and, in quieter moments, to grieve, his hands folded, his expression carefully neutral in a way that Min-jun, exhausted and raw and out of patience, did not have the composure to match. 3 locations burned in one night, Kong said, when Min-jun took his seat. A police cordon 3 districts wide. Reporters asking questions we cannot afford to answer. You are bleeding this organization dry over one woman, Min-jun, and the board has concerns. One woman, Min-jun repeated, very quietly, who has bled for this family more times than any of you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the vest, Deborah's vest, still stiff with dried blood, the plate cracked clean through where the round had struck. And set it down on the polished table with a sound that landed in the room like a verdict. This is what loyalty looks like. This is what she traded to keep me breathing. And someone in this city, someone with the access and the money to order a custom round through our own supply chain, decided that wasn't enough, decided I needed to be taught a lesson, or removed entirely, and used her to do it. A murmur went around the table. Kang's expression didn't move, not even slightly, and something about that stillness needled at the back of Min-jun's mind even as he pushed past it, too exhausted, too furious to chase the thought any further. You will find whoever gave that order, Min-jun said, looking at each of them in turn, or you will be treated as accomplices to it. I don't care whose brother, whose son, whose oldest friend it turns out to be. I will burn this entire organization to its foundation before I let this go unanswered. Are we clear? No one at the table spoke. Kong was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice smooth and measured, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much heat a room could take before it broke. You sound like a man who has stopped thinking clearly, nephew. Maybe, Min-jun said, rising from his chair. Or maybe I've finally started. He left the vest on the table when he walked out. He was at Deborah's bedside 2 hours later when the machines beside the bed gave a soft, uneven chime and her eyes opened, glassy and unfocused, fighting through sedation to find something to hold on to. Min-jun, she rasped, the word barely more than breath. I'm here. Min-jun was up out of his chair instantly, leaning close, gripping her hand like it was the only solid thing left in the room. I'm right here. Don't try to talk, the doctor said. Listen to me. Deborah's fingers tightened weakly around his. Her eyes, though clouded with pain and drugs, held a terrible clarity. The shot. The angle. I've run protection details for 6 years, I know every blind spot on that route by heart, and there wasn't supposed to be one there. Someone changed it. Someone with access to the convoy plan changed the route timing, just enough, just long enough for a shooter to set up in that exact window. Her breath rattled, wet and shallow, and she pushed through it anyway, because some things mattered more than pain. It wasn't outside. It came from inside the convoy plan, Min-jun, somebody close enough to change your route without anyone asking questions. Min-jun went very still. Sleep, he said finally, his voice rough, pressing her hand between both of his own. You did your job. You did everything right. Now let me do mine. Deborah's eyes slid shut again, sedation pulling her back under, and Min-jun sat there in the dim hospital light for a long time afterward, turning the words over and over, feeling the shape of a betrayal beginning to take form somewhere close, far closer than he wanted to believe. The high-rise overlooking 4th Street had been empty for 11 months, a half-finished office tower abandoned when its developer ran out of money and connections in the same disastrous quarter. Min-jun climbed to the 9th floor himself, flashlight in hand, 2 of his most trusted men behind him, and found the nest exactly where he expected it. A window with the glass removed clean and careful, 3 spent shell casings lined up with the fastidious precision of a professional who took pride in her work, and a cheap burner phone half melted in the corner where someone had tried, and failed, to burn away the evidence. His tech specialist had the phone gutted and its guts spread across a lab table within the hour, painstakingly resurrecting fragments of a payment trail scattered across encrypted wallets and shell accounts designed to lead nowhere. It took most of the night. It was nearly dawn again by the time the specialist finally looked up from the screen, her face pale in the blue light of her monitors. Boss, she said. The final payment. It didn't come from a rival syndicate. It didn't come from outside our organization at all. She turned the monitor toward him. The wire traced back through 4 shell accounts, each one a little less obscured than the last, until it arrived at an offshore account tied, unmistakably, undeniably, to the logistics arm of his own syndicate. His organization. His infrastructure. Money that had passed, at some point, through hands close enough to touch his own. Min-jun stood very still, staring at the screen, feeling the last piece of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to solve click quietly into place. This had never been about a rival gang trying to seize territory in the chaos of a leadership change. This had been about someone close, someone with intimate knowledge of his convoy routes, his schedule, his weaknesses. Engineering a war designed to look reckless, designed to make him look unstable and grief-maddened in front of the very board that had the power to remove him. Strip away his shield. Provoke him into scorching the city in a blind, ungoverned rage. Let him destroy his own credibility one burning warehouse at a time, until the elders had no choice but to agree that Min-jun was unfit to lead. And someone else, someone patient and careful and already sitting at that boardroom table, would be waiting to take his place. Min-jun thought of Elder Kang's still, unreadable face across the table. Of the smooth, measured voice that had called him a man who'd stopped thinking clearly. He thought of the vest, sitting there on the polished table where he'd left it, and felt something in his chest go colder than the rain-soaked night that had started all of this. Whoever they were, they had made him into exactly the man they wanted him to be. It was time to stop being useful to them. The clinic was quiet in the deep hours before dawn, quiet enough that Min-jun could hear the soft mechanical rhythm of the machines keeping watch over Deborah, quiet enough that his own thoughts grew loud in the empty spaces between heartbeats on the monitor. He sat in the hard plastic chair he'd claimed as his own 3 nights running, elbows on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the bandages, and let himself remember, for the first time in years, the night none of this had started. He'd been 22, a syndicate heir sent overseas on his father's business, young and arrogant enough to believe the danger was theoretical until the extraction point collapsed into gunfire and smoke and a building coming down around his ears. He remembered the deafening percussion of it, the way the world had narrowed to dust and heat, and the certainty that he was about to die in a country whose language he barely spoke. And then a stranger's hand had closed around his collar, hauling him bodily through a collapsing doorway, a voice low and steady in his ear telling him to move, to breathe, to trust her. Deborah had been a contractor then, hired muscle with no particular reason to care whether the spoiled young heir made it out alive. She'd carried him 3 blocks through a war zone anyway, taken a grazement for both of them, and never once, in 6 years since, mentioned it again unless Min-jun brought it up first. That was the foundation of everything. Not employment. Not a paycheck. A debt that could never be repaid, only honored, and Min-jun understood now, watching the machines tick steadily beside the bed, that it was the truest thing he had left in a life built on nothing but calculated risk. The corridor lights flickered once, and went out. Min-jun's head came up instantly, every soft, exhausted edge of him sharpening back into the man who'd survived a war zone at 22. The emergency backup should have kicked in immediately. It hadn't. Somewhere down the hall, glass shattered, deliberate, controlled, the sound of a door being breached rather than an accident, and he was on his feet with his pistol drawn before the first gunshot even echoed through the dark. Get her under cover, he snapped at the 2 guards posted outside Deborah's door, and they moved without question, dragging the gurney back behind a reinforced supply cabinet as the corridor beyond erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the hallway in stuttering strobes, 4, maybe 5 shooters moving in tight coordinated pairs, professionals, not street thugs, men who knew exactly which room they were here for. Min-jun ducked low around the doorframe and returned fire, dropping the lead shooter with 2 rounds before the man's partner could pull him back into cover. His remaining guards fell in beside him, a tight defensive knot in the narrow dark corridor, trading fire in short disciplined bursts while nurses and patients screamed and scrambled for cover in the rooms behind them. It was close, ugly work, the kind fought at 10 feet instead of 100, and twice Min-jun felt a round crack the wall inches from his head, close enough to feel the wind of it. He put the last shooter down himself, point blank, in the flickering strobe of emergency lighting finally kicking back on, and stood there afterward in a corridor gone suddenly, terribly silent, breathing hard, his ears ringing, for bodies on the tile floor around him. His lieutenant found the burner radio clipped to the lead shooter's vest a few minutes later. Still live, a single line of chatter caught on it before the channel went dead, target confirmed alive, proceed as planned. Min-jun stood over the body for a long moment, feeling the last of his exhaustion burn away into something harder and more purposeful. Only someone inside his own circle could have known Deborah survived the shooting at all. The clinic's location was a closely held secret, need to know among perhaps a dozen people in the entire organization. Someone on that very short list had made a call tonight, ordering a finishing blow on a woman already fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Min-jun thought of Elder Kang still, composed face across the boardroom table, and for the first time let the suspicion sit in his chest without flinching away from it. He didn't confront Kang directly. Confrontation without proof was a losing hand, and Min-jun had learned enough about patience in the last 4 days to know better than to waste his only advantage. Instead, he let the city believe a lie. Within 48 hours, whispered word moved through Koreatown's underworld exactly as Min-jun intended it to, that his head of security had succumbed to her wounds in the night, that the grief and guilt of losing the woman closest to him had finally broken something in the young boss, and that Min-jun himself, hollowed out and directionless, was preparing to step back from active leadership of the syndicate. It was, he knew, precisely the story someone patient and ambitious would have been waiting to hear. The response came faster than he expected. Within a day, word reached him that Elder Kong had called an emergency council meeting, not in the tower boardroom, but at the industrial docks the syndicate used for its shipping operations, a sprawling complex of rusted cranes and stacked containers on the edge of the harbor. Chosen, Min-jun suspected, because it was far enough from prying eyes to declare a change in leadership without interference. Every major lieutenant in the organization had been summoned. Min-jun arrived alone. He came on foot through the rain, no convoy, no visible security, just a single figure in a dark coat walking into the sodium-lit sprawl of the dockyard where Elder Kong stood beneath a corrugated awning addressing a half-circle of the syndicate's most powerful captains, all of them wet and uneasy in the downpour. A difficult time for this organization, Kong was saying, and difficult times require steady hands. Min-jun has proven himself unfit to finish that sentence, Min-jun said, stepping into the light. I'd like to hear exactly what you think I'm unfit for, uncle. The gathered lieutenants went rigid. Kang's composure flickered, just for a heartbeat, before smoothing back into place. Min-jun. We heard that Deborah was dead. That I'd broken. That the throne was conveniently empty. Min-jun walked forward, unhurried, rain running off his collar, and pulled a folded printout from inside his coat. The financial trail his tech specialist had spent a sleepless night assembling, wire transfers traced back through 4 shell accounts to a name every man present would recognize. He held it up for the assembled captains to see. This is a payment authorization for a custom armor-piercing round, purchased through our own supply network, routed through an offshore account that traces directly back to Elder Kang's personal holdings. The same round that nearly killed my head of security. The same man who sent a hit squad into a hospital 3 nights ago to finish the job. Silence spread through the dockyard, broken only by rain hammering against steel containers. You would believe forged documents, Kong said, over 30 years of loyalty to this family. I'd believe evidence, Min-jun said, over a man who taught me that loyalty is worth exactly what someone's willing to pay for it. I learned that lesson from you, uncle. I just never expected to see you prove it so well. Kang's expression finally cracked, the smooth mask sliding away to reveal something colder and far more desperate underneath. You were never fit to hold this, Kong said, his voice low and venomous. A boy playing at being a king. I built half of what you inherited with my own hands, and you would have burned it into ash chasing sentiment over 1 bodyguard. Maybe, Min-jun said. Or maybe I finally understand the difference between the two. Kong raised a hand, and the dockyard came apart at the seams. Floodlights mounted on the cranes snapped on all at once, and from behind the stacked shipping containers, a small army of mercenaries Kong had smuggled in over the preceding days opened fire in a single coordinated volley. Min-jun dove for cover behind a rusted container as gunfire chewed through the metal where he'd been standing, and around him the dockyard erupted into full-scale war, his loyal lieutenants scrambling for position, exchanging fire with Kang's rogue enforcers, rain and muzzle flash and the roar of igniting fuel drums turning the whole complex into a churning hell of noise and fire. A shipping container went up in a fireball as a stray round found something flammable inside it, throwing orange light and black smoke across the whole yard, and Min-jun used the chaos to move, ducking low between cover, putting down 2 of Kang's men with controlled shots before a third pinned him hard against a container wall, round sparking off the metal inches from his head. He was good. He'd trained his whole life to be good. But Kang's mercenaries were professionals in greater number than he'd anticipated, and one man, however skilled, could only hold a losing position for so long. Min-jun felt the bite of a graze along his forearm, felt his magazine run dry at the worst possible moment, and understood with a cold, clear certainty that he had walked into this confrontation prepared to die making his point. That was when the gate at the far end of the dockyard exploded inward. An armored transport truck tore through the chain-link fence in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, headlights cutting twin beams through smoke and rain, and it plowed directly into the flank of Kang's mercenary position before the driver's door flew open and a figure dropped out, moving with the stiff, deliberate care of a woman whose ribs had been rebuilt with wire and titanium 4 days earlier. Deborah had torn the 4 line out of her own arm, dressed herself in field armor over bandages that should have kept her bedridden for another month, and driven through Koreatown traffic on nothing but the raw certainty that Min-jun was somewhere in this city about to get himself killed. "You're supposed to be in a hospital bed," Min-jun shouted, half in disbelief, half in something that felt dangerously close to relief. "You're supposed to know better than to walk into an ambush alone," Deborah shot back, already firing, already moving to cover Min-jun's exposed flank with the same cold precision she'd shown on 100 quieter nights. "Guess we're both bad at listening to good advice." They fought back-to-back through the burning dockyard, exactly the way they'd trained for years without ever expecting to need it this badly, Min-jun clearing left while Deborah held right, moving through the chaos of flame and smoke and driving rain like two halves of the same weapon. What Kang's mercenaries hadn't accounted for was that a wounded woman fighting beside the person she'd die for was still worth 3 men fighting for money, and one by one the rogue enforcers fell back, scattered, or went down entirely under the combined fury of the two people Kang had tried so carefully to separate. They found Kang himself near the water's edge, backed against a stack of burning containers, his composure finally, completely gone. Min-jun closed the distance and Kang came at him with a desperation that had nothing left of the smooth, patient Uncle Min-jun had grown up trusting, wild, brutal, throwing his weight into a strike that Min-jun sidestepped, catching Kang's wrist and driving it hard against his knee, forcing the older man's weapon to clatter uselessly onto wet concrete. Kang went down hard, and Min-jun stood over him in the flickering orange light, breathing hard, rain running down his face, feeling nothing that resembled triumph. "Family," Kang gasped, on his knees now, looking up with something like desperate pleading in his eyes. "I raised you after your father died, Min-jun, whatever else I've done, I am still your blood." "You stopped being my family," Min-jun said, "the moment you decided the easiest way to take my throne was to put a bullet in the one woman who never once asked me for anything." He looked past Kang to the ring of lieutenants who'd gathered at a careful distance, weapons lowered now, watching in the firelight as the man who'd tried to seize their loyalty knelt broken and exposed in front of them. "Let every one of you witness this. This is what happens to men who mistake patience for loyalty." Kang's hand moved fast, desperate, closing around a knife hidden at his belt, lunging up and forward in one last, ugly bid to take Min-jun down with him. Deborah was faster. She'd been faster her entire life, and pain and bandages and torn stitches did nothing to slow the instinct that had carried her through a burning street and a burning dockyard both, and she put Elder Kang down permanently before the blade ever came close enough to matter, ending the coup exactly where it had begun. In blood, in rain, and in the wreckage of a war that had never needed to happen at all. The weeks that followed were quieter than any Min-jun could remember in his adult life. With Kang gone and the traitors within his organization systematically identified and removed, Min-jun called a very different kind of board meeting. One where he laid out, calmly and without room for negotiation, his intention to wind down the syndicate's illicit operations entirely, folding what remained of the organization's assets into a legitimate security and real estate enterprise that could operate in daylight, answer to no rival gang, and answer, above all, to nothing but its own ledger. Some of the elders resisted. Fewer than he expected. Kang's betrayal, and the violence it had cost the city, had done more to convince the old guard of the wisdom of legitimacy than any speech Min-jun could have given them. Deborah's recovery took months, longer than either of them liked, filled with physical therapy and quiet, patient mornings that neither of them had ever had the luxury of before. Min-jun visited every week without fail, no longer out of guilt, but because some habits, once built on something true, were worth keeping simply for their own sake. By the time the new headquarters opened its doors, a clean glass tower rising over a Koreatown finally, blessedly quiet, its neon signs reflecting off dry pavement instead of rain and blood, Deborah had fully healed, standing tall in a tailored suit that fit differently over a frame reshaped by scar tissue and old violence, out on the balcony beside Min-jun as the city spread out golden and peaceful beneath them in the evening light. "You know," Deborah said, "there was a time you'd have called this soft. Buildings instead of blood." "There was a time I thought loyalty was something you bought," Min-jun said, "and you spent 6 years proving me wrong without ever once asking me to notice." He turned, holding out a folder, ownership papers, equal partnership, a name added permanently beside his own on the deed to everything they'd rebuilt from the ashes of that first burning night. You've never been my bodyguard, Deborah. Not really. I think I finally understand what you actually were. Deborah took the folder, and for a long moment said nothing at all, only adjusted the line of her jacket over the scar hidden beneath it, and smiled, not the tight, professional smile of a woman doing her job, but something easier, something earned. Below them, Koreatown glittered on, rebuilt and quiet and finally, entirely at peace.